Great rivalries in history. Elizabeth I, Queen of England, versus Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France. Thank you to Happy Mammoth for sponsoring this video. For most of history, men ruled the world. But for 3 decades in the late 1500s, 2 powerful women dominated Europe. Catherine de' Medici was Queen of France, and Elizabeth I, Queen of England. Neither one was expected to be queen, but both bid their time until they could seize power. They were brilliant, dynamic, determined, and sometimes ruthless leaders. But even with all they had in common, their differences made them fierce opponents. Catherine was a Catholic, a wife and a mother, while Elizabeth was Protestant and single by choice. Dozens of books and dramas have focused on the epic rivalry between Elizabeth and her northern neighbor, Mary, Queen of Scots. And while she is an important part of the story, Elizabeth's relationship with her greater nemesis, Catherine, has long been forgotten. However, Season 2 of the Starz series Serpent Queen and the recent book Blood, Fire, and Gold by Estelle Paranque have resurrected the historic frienemies. Let's examine the parallel lives and epic rivalry between Elizabeth I and Catherine de' Medici. Catherine was born in 1519 in Florence. Her mother was a French noblewoman and her father a member of the Medici family. They had risen from merchants to one of the wealthiest and most influential families in Renaissance Italy. Among their ranks were dukes and popes, and they had ambition to climb even higher. Within a month of Catherine's birth, her mother died of the plague, and her father of syphilis. The orphaned baby was taken in by relatives. When she was 4, her cousin was elected Pope Clement VII. He returned her to Florence, where she was addressed as the Little Duchess. When she was 8, the Medicis were ousted, and Catherine was held prisoner in a convent. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V laid siege to Florence, and there were calls for Catherine to be killed and chained naked to the city wall. But eventually the siege ended, and Catherine was sent to Rome to the protection of Pope Clement, who greeted her with open arms and immediately set out to find her a husband. Suitors lined up for the wealthy heiress. James V of Scotland was considered, but when King Francois I of France offered his second son, Henri, Duke of Orleans, the Pope jumped at the chance. Francois was a strong leader and a Renaissance polymath who greatly enhanced the power of France, much like his contemporary and nemesis, Henry VIII of England. The kings were only 3 years apart in age and had both inherited their thrones as strapping young men. They were also both notorious womanizers. In 1520, they met for a peace summit at the Field of Cloth of Gold. This was likely where Henry first met Anne Boleyn, an English lady who was living at the French court as a maid of honor to Francois's wife, Queen Claude. The kings feasted, drank from fountains of wine, and had a wrestling match which Francois won. Henry's bruised ego, plus centuries of battle between France and England, including a literal 100 years war, meant that peace didn't last. Henry fell hard for witty and stylish Anne Boleyn. He was annoyed that his wife of 24 years, Catherine of Aragon, had delivered only a daughter, Mary, rather than his longed-for male heir. So he split England from the Catholic Church in order to annul his marriage. Francois was open to Protestantism and allowed it to spread in France. His sister, Marguerite, had converted and was a big influence on Anne Boleyn. Anne and Henry traveled to Calais in 1532 to meet with Francois, and his personal endorsement allowed them to finally wed after 7 years of legal and political battles. But many on both sides of the Channel remained staunchly Catholic, opposed Henry's remarriage, and accused Anne of being a witch. Nevertheless, Anne, already pregnant, was crowned in Westminster Abbey in 1533. That September, she gave birth to a child. Henry was crestfallen that it was another daughter, Elizabeth. Francois surely felt a bit smug, as 1 month later, he oversaw the wedding of his second son to Catherine de' Medici. The wedding of the two 14-year-olds was a fabulous affair. Catherine's less than elegant features were embellished by a radiant gown of gold damask, with ropes of jewels and 6 large teardrop pearls. A gold crown concealed the fact that she was not of royal blood, and her short stature was enhanced by high heels, which had never been seen before in France and became wildly popular. At midnight, the newlyweds left the feast to perform their marital duties. King Francois stayed to watch while the marriage was consummated. He reported that each had shown valor in the joust. Catherine fell in love with her charming and gentle groom, but Henri was already in love with 38-year-old Diane du Poitiers and showed little interest in his bride. She was under immense pressure to bear an heir, but this was unlikely to happen if she couldn't entice her husband to sleep with her. When Pope Clement died, the new pope broke the alliance with France and stopped payments on Catherine's dowry. Meanwhile, in England, Anne Boleyn was having her own reproductive difficulties. Henry fell from his horse during a joust, and the shock caused Anne to miscarry. When her enemies delivered false evidence of adultery and incest, Henry was all too eager to be rid of his second wife and move on to a third. Anne was beheaded in the Tower of London. Her 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. She spent her childhood in and out of royal favor, based on her father's whims, as he went through 4 more wives. She did win some paternal admiration with her astonishing intelligence and fluency in multiple languages. King Francois's eldest son, Francois, caught a chill after a game of tennis and died. As the new heir, it was essential that Henri have a son of his own. He had been married to Catherine for 11 years with no results, so his father began discussing divorce. In desperation, Catherine tried every trick she could to promote conception, including placing cow dung and ground stag's antlers on her source of life, and drinking mule's urine. Rumors began circling that she was a witch. But at last, she managed to get her husband to spend more time with her, and she gave birth to a son. She quickly conceived again and eventually delivered 10 children. In the epic rivalry between England and France, there was a third party, Scotland. They had a long-standing alliance with France against England. Henry VIII went to war with his nephew, King James V, and the young man died after a battle, leaving the throne to his 6-day-old daughter, Mary. Henry wanted to force the baby to wed his own son, Edward. But when the Scots refused, the king infiltrated a series of violent raids on Scotland, known as the Rough Wooing. For her protection, 5-year-old Queen Mary was sent to France, where she was raised with Catherine's children and betrothed to her eldest son. Henry VIII and Francois I died within 6 weeks of each other in 1547. The English crown went to 9-year-old Edward VI. 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth lived with her stepmother, Catherine Parr, but her new husband, Thomas Seymour, who happened to be the king's uncle, acted inappropriately towards the teenage princess. When Catherine caught Thomas kissing Elizabeth, she sent her away for her protection. Months later, Catherine died of childbed fever, and Thomas immediately proposed to Elizabeth. She wisely turned him down. Thomas was desperate for power and tried to kidnap the young king, killing his dog in a scheme. Thomas was arrested and Elizabeth was interrogated about her involvement, but was found innocent. Thomas was beheaded. In France, Henri II and Catherine became king and queen. He granted her no political power and made Diane the center of the court. He often sat on her lap and fondled her breasts in full view of the court. Catherine expressed her desire for the chateau of Chenonceau, but Henry gave it to Diane. The queen swallowed her pride and accepted her humiliation. Over time, Henri came to value her loyalty. Catherine nearly died giving birth to twin daughters, Joan and Victoire, and after the tragedy, she was no longer able to bear children. Calamity also struck England when Edward VI died of tuberculosis at 15. He was a staunch Protestant, and he and his ministers dreaded his elder sister, Mary, inheriting the throne and converting the nation back to Catholicism. Elizabeth was Protestant, but the only legal grounds to disinherit Mary meant skipping Elizabeth II in favor of their cousin, Lady Jane Grey. She was declared queen by the Privy Council, but Mary was popular with the people. She easily raised an army and marched to London, with Elizabeth by her side, ending Jane's reign in only 9 days. Mary, now queen, recognized that Jane had been a pawn, and she did not wish to execute her. But when rebellion frightened Mary's betrothed, Philip of Spain, away, she signed the death warrant, and the 16-year-old, 9 days queen lost her head. Mary made quick work of undoing her father and brother's efforts to convert the nation. She ordered 280 Protestants to be burned at the stake, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary, though she actually executed far fewer people than her tyrannical father. As a Protestant, Elizabeth knew that she was in danger. She pretended to convert, but made excuses and faked illnesses to avoid attending Mass. A rebellion rose up in Elizabeth's favor, and she was taken to the Tower and interrogated about her involvement. The 18-year-old was terrified that she would meet the same end as her mother, but she was eventually released and placed under house arrest. She behaved as modestly and obediently as she could to avoid her sister's wrath. Mary was nearly 40 and desperate to produce a Catholic heir. She believed that she was pregnant, but as the 10th and 11th months ticked by with no signs of labor, her swollen belly receded. Following the humiliation of her false pregnancy, her husband left her for battle on the continent. Philip of Spain was incredibly unpopular in England. He was embroiled in war with Henri II of France, and he only returned to Mary to sweet-talk her into sending English troops to fight his battles. Henri decided to name his loyal wife Catherine regent while he marched off to war. She made an impassioned speech, securing more funding for his army, thus enabling the French to successfully take Calais. The port city was England's last possession on mainland Europe, and its loss was yet another humiliating blow to Queen Mary. She died at 42 of uterine cancer after 5 years on the throne. On November 17, 1558, messengers bowed before Elizabeth and informed her that she was now queen. A train of thousands of lords and ladies accompanied her to London as crowds cheered. Elizabeth, like Catherine, understood the value of image. Both queens dressed fabulously to convey their greatness. On January 15, 1559, Elizabeth walked into Westminster Abbey. She was crowned Queen of England, Ireland, and because the English were still salty about Calais, Queen of France as well. The date was chosen by Elizabeth's astrologer. Catherine was also keen on astrology, which was viewed as the cutting-edge science of the day. Her personal astrologer was Nostradamus. He predicted, "The young lion shall overcome the old one on the field of combat in single battle. He shall pierce his eye in a golden cage. 2 forces 1, then he shall die a cruel death." In July 1559, King Henri competed in a jousting tournament. Catherine had an ill premonition and begged him to stop, but he was eager to show off for Diane. His opponent's lance shattered, and 5 large splinters pierced the king's helmet, embedding in his head and eye. Catherine stayed by his side for 10 days. The doctors were terrified to remove the splinters. They inflicted similar wounds on prisoners and practiced surgical techniques, but all the men died. The king slowly lost his sight, speech, and reason. He called out repeatedly for Diane, but the queen barred her from the room. Henri died in agony at the age of 40. Catherine dropped the mask of modesty and obedience she had worn for her husband and took revenge on the woman who had humiliated her for years. She forced Diane to hand over the crown jewels, the Château de Chenonceau, and banished her from court. Catherine's 15-year-old son was now King Francois II, and his wife, Mary Queen of Scots, was queen consort. Mary had admired Diane and often repeated the horrible things she said about Catherine, being the daughter of a shoemaker and not worthy of the crown. Catherine hid her dislike of her daughter-in-law and gifted her the giant teardrop pearls she had worn at her own wedding. As the new queen consort, Mary had the power to eclipse the Dowager Queen, but her own maternal uncles, the Guise brothers, beat her to it. They moved into the palace with the young couple and seized power. They were devout Catholics and set about persecuting Protestants, called Huguenots. Both sides carried out massacres against each other, and civil war loomed. After 18 months on the throne, Francois fell ill with an ear infection. It caused an abscess in his brain, and he died a cruel death, fulfilling Nostradamus' prophecy. Catherine negotiated a pact with the Huguenot leaders, which made her regent for her 9-year-old son, now King Charles IX. After decades of biding her time, she was finally in power. She created a new position for herself as Queen Mother and would outrank any future consorts. Mary asked to remain in France, but Catherine promptly sent her back to Scotland. Because she was a granddaughter of Henry VII and the highest-ranking Catholic in the line of succession, Mary insisted that she was the rightful Queen of England, deeply annoying Elizabeth. Elizabeth and Catherine were now both in the incredibly rare position of being queens in control of their own respective kingdoms. They began a long and complex relationship, which evolved over thousands of letters and messages between ambassadors, though they never met in person. Catherine did her best to broker peace between Huguenots and Catholics. But another massacre sparked the French Wars of Religion, which would tear the country apart for 30 years. Elizabeth gave financial support to the Huguenots, and they took the port city of Le Havre. Elizabeth wrote to Catherine offering to exchange Le Havre for Calais. But Catherine went to the Huguenot leader and convinced him that he must be French first, Protestant second. He handed back Le Havre, and Elizabeth was miffed by the betrayal. The Duke of Guise was shot and killed, and Catherine secretly celebrated. She took her son on progress around the country to promote peace, but they were ambushed by Huguenots and barely escaped. We all have times where we feel like Elizabeth and Catherine and just can't play well with others. But I was feeling this way more than I wanted to, so I tried Hormone Harmony from Happy Mammoth. It helps smooth out all the ups and downs I used to experience during my menstrual cycle, like breakouts, cravings, upset stomach, and insomnia. The biggest difference both I and my family have noticed is my moods are much more stable, and I generally feel like my best self more of the time. Hormone Harmony can help women of any age who are experiencing unpleasant symptoms of menstruation, perimenopause, menopause, or postmenopause. It's based on the ancient plant knowledge of our foremothers, backed by modern science, and loved by over 17,000 women. For a limited time, you can get 15% off your entire first order at happymammoth.com with the code TEATIME at checkout. That's happymammoth.com with code TEATIME. And now, back to history. While Elizabeth didn't have to deal with the Civil War, religion was one of her most significant problems too. Once on the throne, she dropped the mask of demure Catholicism she had worn for her sister and dismissed all the bishops who refused to recognize her as the Protestant head of the church. But she didn't burn them at the stake. Elizabeth had inherited an ailing country, bankrupt, militarily weak, and surrounded by enemies. The most expedient way to bolster the nation was through a marriage alliance. Her advisors urged her to select a groom who could run the country for her while she got on with making babies. Her widowed brother-in-law, King Philip of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria, and Eric XIV of Sweden all vied for her hand. Catherine had gained all of her royal prestige through marriage and motherhood, and she had no concept of any other path for a woman. She may also have been jealous of the fact that Elizabeth was a queen regnant in her own right, while Catherine could only grasp power through her husband and sons. She had 3 sons and was keen to place one of them on the English throne. First, she offered King Charles IX. He was only 16, and Elizabeth politely declined. She gave a powerful speech to Parliament, declaring that she was married to England and intended to remain a virgin to her dying day. Elizabeth's father had murdered her mother, Thomas Seymour had abused her, and Philip of Spain had undermined her sister's rule. It's little wonder that Elizabeth wasn't keen to hand over her power to a husband. But she did enjoy flirtations, particularly with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, with whom she may have had a secret sexual relationship. Single by choice was an unheard of concept in the 1500s, and Catherine continued to play nice with Elizabeth, in the hopes that she might select one of her sons. Elizabeth had another idea. She wrote to her cousin, Mary, and offered Robert Dudley, promising to make their offspring her heir. But Mary didn't want Elizabeth's cast-off. She instead wed her handsome cousin, Henry Darnley. He turned out to be arrogant and violent, and murdered Mary's secretary in front of her while she was pregnant. Darnley's bedroom exploded, and Mary promptly wed the #1 suspect, James Bothwell, possibly under duress. The Scots forced their queen to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son, James. She fled to England in the hopes that Elizabeth would help, but instead she was arrested and imprisoned for 19 years. By 1570, Catherine's third and favorite son, Henri, was a dashing 18-year-old. She sent a portrait to Elizabeth, who was now 37 and somewhat interested. But Henri arrogantly protested that he would not marry a public whore. The comment got back to Elizabeth, and that marriage was dead in the water. Catherine instead got Henri elected king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. She also arranged a marriage between her daughter, Margaret, and Henri, the Protestant king of Navarre. Many well-born Huguenots traveled to Paris to celebrate the tentative peace. But the interfaith marriage was controversial and tensions were high. Henri had to remain outside of Notre Dame Cathedral while the wedding mass was celebrated. On the feast of Saint Bartholomew, while guests were nursing hangovers, the Guises decided to settle a blood feud with Huguenot leader du Coligny. He was shot from a window. His spilled blood boiled the tensions into a massacre. Huguenots were slaughtered all over Paris, and the violence spread into the countryside. As many as 30,000 men, women, and children were murdered during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Catherine was popularly blamed for the bloodbath. Rumors spread that she was involved in the occult. However, her vilification as a ruthless Serpent Queen had more to do with xenophobia and misogyny. In reality, she desperately wanted peace. She actually opened her home to Huguenots and protected many. The violence in France shook Protestants everywhere, including Elizabeth. The Pope had declared that any Catholic who killed the heretical queen would secure a place in heaven. Her secret police dealt with constant assassination attempts. But none of them came from Catherine, who still held out hope that she might become Elizabeth's mother-in-law. The massacre took a toll on Charles's mental health. He vacillated between bragging about the bloodbath and screaming at his mother. Catherine remarked sadly that she had a lunatic for a son. Within 2 years, his health deteriorated, and he died of tuberculosis at 23. For the 14 years of his reign, his mother had been the real ruler of France. Her third son was now King Henri III. He immediately dropped Poland and returned to France. In addition to the Huguenots, he had to deal with the rise of the Catholic League. His enemies delighted in using rumors of his homosexuality to undermine his authority. Catherine had one more ace up her sleeve to play to Elizabeth. her youngest son, Francois. He was 24 and Elizabeth 46 when he began to send her steamy letters. Robert Dudley had recently gotten married, and Elizabeth was on the rebound. Francois was the only one of her suitors who actually came to woo her in person, and she was incredibly flattered. She called him her frog. She accepted his proposal and gave him a ring. But public opinion was against them, and a pamphlet circulated condemning the foreign marriage. Elizabeth ordered its writer to have his hands chopped off, but she knew that she couldn't go against her people's wishes. She broke up with Francois, and he left in disappointment and flung her ring from his finger. When she learned that he had died of malaria at 29, she was heartbroken. Francois's death was more than a tragedy for Catherine. It was a disaster for the House of Valois. After a decade of marriage to Louise of Lorraine, King Henri had no children. The next in line to the throne was his distant Protestant cousin, Henri of Navarre. The result was a succession crisis, with each faction putting forth their own alternatives for the throne. Now that there was no longer any chance of Elizabeth becoming Catherine's daughter-in-law, she had no more reason to play nice. Catherine was horrified when Elizabeth executed Mary. The Queen of Scots had been plotting to assassinate Elizabeth, but murdering another crowned monarch just wasn't done. Mary's personal effects, including the drop pearls Catherine had given her as a wedding gift, became property of the crown. Elizabeth wore them on her ruff. 4 of them now hang below the mound on the British imperial state crown. Catherine never wrote to Elizabeth again. She wasn't the only monarch who was livid. Philip II of Spain sent the Spanish armada to invade England and dethrone the heretical queen. He had twice as many ships, but hers were faster. Elizabeth gave a stirring speech, proclaiming that, though I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, I have the heart and stomach of a king. The English won the battle, and many Spanish ships were wrecked in storms on their retreat. The victory was Elizabeth's finest hour. She was hailed as a goddess, Gloriana. With peace and stability, her reign became a golden era for England. Trade, art, and literature flourished, and her people grew wealthy. Walter Raleigh established an English colony in North America, named Virginia in his queen's honor. While Elizabeth was basking, Catherine's control was slipping. Henri had always been her favorite child, but he was headstrong. Her influence waned as he took her advice less and less. Instead, he struck up an unlikely friendship with Elizabeth and came to prefer her opinion, deeply wounding his mother. Henri was not as effective a ruler as either woman. His people hated him for his extravagance, paid for with high taxes, and his homosexuality. The Catholic League took over northern France and barricaded Paris. Henri requested that their leader, the Duke of Guise, visit him in his chamber. When he arrived, the Duke was stabbed to death by the king's guards. At the same moment, 8 other members of the Guise family were hacked to death by Henri's men. The king went to his mother and begged her forgiveness, professing, "I have done to him what he was going to do to me." Catherine told her own confessor, "Pray for him. I see him rushing towards his ruin." A few days later, Queen Catherine died at the age of 69. She had devoted her life to her children, but one by one, disease and war had taken them from her. That summer, Henri was assassinated by a fanatical Dominican friar, and Henri of Navarre became the new King of France. He converted to Catholicism in order to win back Paris and the throne. This meant that Catherine's daughter, Margaret, was the new Queen of France. But their marriage had not started on a great foot. They hated each other and had no children. Henri divorced Margaret and married Catherine's cousin, Marie de Medici, instead. It was a blessing that Catherine didn't live to see the Valois dynasty come to an end. Elizabeth lived in glory for another 14 years. She died at 69, the same age as Catherine. And with her, the curtains were also drawn on the Tudor dynasty. Courtiers rushed north to inform Mary's son, King James VI of Scotland, that he was now King James I of England. Though the two tremendous queens were alike in their cunning, courage, and unlikely climbs to power, they made very different choices. They both tried to do right by their people, but their vastly divergent circumstances led to one being glorified and the other vilified. And they both ended in much the same place, as dazzling exclamation points at the end of two great dynasties. In the next episode, I'll take a closer look at the Medici family, reveal how they climbed from Italian merchants to Renaissance royalty, and unveil their darkest scandals. Don't want to wait to see the next episode? Patrons get exclusive early access to all of my multi-part series. If you would like to join my Patreon and help me make more fascinating videos, click on the link in the description. Thank you for watching.